Hello, I'm Bob Burrill. I'm recording this on Wednesday, May 6th, 2026, and the title is Don't Try to Help God Out. Don't try to help God out. Interestingly enough, on Sunday I had in mind a certain topic I wanted to speak and teach about, make a video about. And I gave it a lot of thought, and I said, boy, on Monday I'm going to make that video. Well, I got so busy on Monday, I never made the video. Then on Tuesday, I said, you know what? I'm going to make that video I've been thinking about. On Tuesday, I didn't make that video. Well, last night I was laying in bed, and I felt so impressed of the Lord not to make the video I was planning to make. And instead, I felt so impressed of the Lord to deal with the topic of Christians and even churches sometimes that try to help God out. They get in the flesh and they try to help God out, and instead of helping God out, they create a disaster. I felt so strongly as I was laying in that bed last night and drifting off to sleep to do that. So this morning when I had a chance, I sat down, I wrote out some notes, and here I am. Not at all what I was planning the last couple of days, and that one I was planning the last couple of days. I guess I'll just do that another time. But first of all, a little story from my background, from my personal life, that's kind of embarrassing. A few weeks ago, I told you a story from my personal life and ministry that was pretty embarrassing. Well, this is another one. This is even more embarrassing. But it's an area where I tried to help God out, and I learned a tough lesson. This is going way back, more than 25 years ago, definitely more than 20, almost probably 27, 28 years ago, something like that. I had a friend, I can't use his real name. I will call my friend Clarence. And Clarence and I both belonged to a non-profit Christian organization. And Clarence's background was a Baptist. He was an independent Baptist. I have a real close friend named Stafford, and that is Stafford's real name, who says, Stafford says there's no such thing as an independent Baptist. But anyway, Clarence at least professed to be an independent Baptist. And he had done undergraduate studies to be a pastor. He was not employed as a pastor. And he had done all sorts of jobs in his life, but he was, as I say, we were involved, I should say, with a Christian nonprofit. He had undergraduate background courses to be a pastor. He wanted in the worst way to be a pastor, and Clarence wanted in the worst way to be ordained. And I'll tell you something, he was a good preacher, he was a good teacher, he really was. A lot of times he'd be a guest speaker at a church, real good preacher, real good teacher, even a good counselor. But he wanted to be ordained, and he constantly just was like crashed into a wall every time he wanted to be ordained, because he'd go to different organizations. One of his biggest problems was he was divorced and remarried. Now, there are some denominations that will credential you if you're divorced and remarried. And some, no matter what the background is regarding that, some, they got to look into it, but as long as they feel it's okay, they'll credential you. I belong to the Assemblies of God. Right now, that's the AG policy. If you're divorced and remarried, they've got to look into it. But if they feel like it was okay, then they'll credential you. If they don't, they won't. Clarence was running into problems. He went to all kinds of organizations, churches, denominations. They said, no, you're divorced and remarried, we won't credential you. Then there were a lot of denominations that won't credential you unless you have a Master of Divinity degree. I don't. I have an undergraduate. I have an undergraduate degree from a Bible college, which is fine with the Assemblies of God, but a lot of denominations insist on an MDiv. Well, Clarence didn't have an MDiv, and Clarence was divorced and remarried, and he kept crashing into that wall. And he wanted to be an ordained minister, and he wanted to be a pastor. Well, guess what? I got a brainstorm. I got a great idea how he could become a pastor. And I said, well, we belong to this nonprofit organization, and we have a constitution and bylaws, right? And we did. And I said, okay, we'll get an attorney to help us, and we did get a Christian attorney to work with us. And I said, we'll add a whole section to our bylaws. And it'll say that we can ordain ministers. And it'll spell out what the education has to be, what the requirements have to be, if you need to renew it annually or not, all this sort of thing. What we do if the minister messes up, discipline procedures, everything legally, just like any denomination a church has regarding ministry. Well, we did that. Had an attorney, wrote everything up, and I think actually what I did is I went to another organization and got copies of their bylaws about credentialing ministers. It wasn't the Assemblies of God, just in case anybody wonders that, but I did. Basically, we copied most of it, filed it with the Secretary of State's office in Massachusetts, got it all done legally, added that to our bylaws, and so now our Christian nonprofit was able to ordain ministers. And we held an ordination service for Clarence. It was on a Sunday afternoon. It was held at a friend of mine's church who was a Baptist minister, and a friend of mine that was an evangelical free pastor was there, part of it. In fact, he spoke. And a friend of mine, I believe that was a Nazarene pastor, was there. He was part of it. Several of us were part of it. It was a very nice service. And, my friend that was an EV free pastor preached. And then we all laid hands on Clarence, and we all ordained him to ministry. And so everything was fine, right? Well, about 7 years later, I used to go every fall to a pastor's prayer retreat up in New Hampshire, run by Vision New England. It was a 3-day retreat, and I went to that retreat, and the first session, the facilitators, after we just had some welcome time and sang a few worship songs, they said, I think the first thing the Lord wants us to do is get in private and pray. Maybe, somewhere around, we were in like a chapel, so they said, find a place around the room and kneel and pray and just ask the Lord, does he have anything against you? But that's a weird way to start a pastor. I mean, I had been to about 10 of these retreats, and they never did that. But okay, so I knelt down, and I asked, Lord, do you have anything against you? And immediately, boom! And it might as well have been in an audible voice. Boy, was it an audible voice? No, it wasn't an audible voice, but it was so powerful. Such a powerful internal impression, it might as well have been. And here's what God said to me. You never asked me about ordaining Clarence, did you? You never asked me about that. You just did it, didn't you? How would you feel if God said that to you? I kind of nervously said, yeah. He said, well, you did the wrong thing. And he said, you never asked me. You should have asked me. And I will forgive you of that. But listen, there will always be consequences for what you did. And when you think about it, ordaining somebody as a pastor is a very serious thing before God. I did it frivolously. I wanted to help Clarence out. I wanted to help him out. I said, this is a way he can be ordained. I'll help him out. And I guess really I was saying, well, since God can't figure out any way to get him ordained, the denominations all say, well, you're divorced and remarried. Well, you don't have an MDiv. I'll help God out. I didn't help anybody out. I remember after that, and we had some break time, and they said before lunch, if anybody needs to kind of like take a walk, there was a lake there. You could do a walk around the lake, which took almost an hour. They said, if anybody needs to take a walk around the lake, you can do that before lunch. Well, I took a walk around the lake. There was a lot of sorrow and repentance for what I had done. This is pretty serious, the stuff of trying to help God out in the flesh. In Genesis chapter 16, Abraham tried to help God out in the flesh. God had promised Abraham a son, and years had gone by and he never had the son. And finally, Abraham decided, well, I'm not going to wait any longer. I mean, we've got this servant girl, Hagar. She's young and healthy. I'm going to have sex with Hagar. And hey, she gets pregnant and has a son. I hit the jackpot. Well, Abraham had sex with Hagar. She got pregnant. She had a son. The son was named But God told him, hey, Abraham, that ain't the son I've been promising you. There is a promised son. That ain't him. In the future, Sarah's going to have a son. Yeah, but Sarah's a really old lady. How can she? Abraham, Sarah's going to have a son. This ain't it. Well, Ishmael became the father of the Arab peoples. Ishmael was not the son. And Abraham had to deal with that the rest of his life. Moses tried to help God out. Moses realized at the age of 40 that he was to be the deliverer of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. There's a whole long story behind that. I could take 20 minutes and tell the long story. Excuse me, I'm not going to do that. I've been 10 minutes on this video. But he killed an Egyptian, right? Moses thought all the Israelites were going to rise up and go like, yeah! And they were going to have a big slave rebellion. They didn't. They said, who do you think you are, pal, killing this Egyptian? You think we would follow you? Moses ended up fleeing and being on the lam for 40 years. He tried to help God out. Now, eventually, he did lead the people out in God's time and in God's way. You know, somebody who didn't try to help God out, and it was a good thing, was Joseph in the Old Testament. He let God handle it. He spent years as a slave and then years in prison. Did somebody say to him in the prison, hey, Joseph, we're going to bust out tonight? I don't know if they did. But even if they did, Joseph would have said, no, I'm not busting out tonight. I'm trusting God to take care of me. If you know the story, God did take care of him big time in Genesis 41 when he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. And he is made the number 2 man in all of Egypt. Listen, many times Christians try to help God out. Even churches try to help God out. Listen, obey God, yes. Obey God, yes. Do what God tells you to do, yes. But don't get in the flesh and try to help God out. That's the word for today. I'd love to have you share this. Honestly, almost nobody shares these videos. Almost nobody does. Almost nobody gives any feedback to these videos. A few people do. Last time I think about 3 or 4 did. I'd love to have you give feedback and I'd love to have you share it. And listen, don't try to help God out. God bless you.